What if the galaxy's weakest species wasn't weak at all? What if the cadet everyone laughed at died in a rigged test, and 23 seconds later, walked out, alive, drenched in blood, holding the system's control core in her hand? This isn't a legend, it's a warning, and it started with a human who refused to stay dead. If you are new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's move toward this wonderful story. The Celestia Core Academy was built to shine like a beacon in the cold dark of space. Floating in orbit above the planet Selvoris 9, it trained the finest military minds from across 1,000 worlds. The Academy accepted only the most gifted cadets from species with centuries of technological advancement, biological advantages, or ancestral claims to greatness. Then there was Unravel, a human from Earth, a planet still laughed at in diplomatic circles for having once considered fire a magical invention. Nara wasn't the smartest cadet. She wasn't the strongest. She didn't glow, vibrate, telepathically, scream, or regenerate missing limbs like some of the others. Her limbs bent in just one direction, her vision was average, and her body was entirely lacking in natural armor, venom sacs, or subdermal energy shields. Her presence at the Celestia Core was treated as a minor clerical joke that got more amusing each year she didn't drop out. No one could quite figure out how she passed the entrance exam, or why she kept passing follow-up evaluations when she looked so perfectly average. Still, Nara endured. Not out of pride, not for glory, but because deep down, she was stubborn, in a way that was hard to explain with biology alone. Her classmates noticed her, but mostly in the way you notice a smudge on glass. The Zeltrians rolled their 12 eyes when she passed. The Drexy whispered in clicking tones she couldn't understand, but the tone was clear enough. Even the Academy instructors couldn't be bothered to remember her name. She was the human one, or that Earth cadet. Her bunk was in the coldest part of the dormitory, her equipment was always second-hand, and her training simulations glitched more often than anyone else's. Nara didn't complain. She simply learned, quietly, constantly. What no one saw was how carefully she observed everything. When the Drexy cadets struggled with reaction timing in close quarters, she noted their movement delays. When the Lithari, those floating gas, forms with hive minds, failed to process sudden changes in their environment, she made a mental note. And when she was dismissed early from tactics class for being not genetically inclined to advanced strategy, she stayed behind anyway and listened through the walls. One evening, the Academy posted simulation assignments for the next day's exam. It was a high-risk environment test, survival under impossible gravitational stress. Most cadets would be tested at their species-specific thresholds. Nara, however, was assigned to Pod 19, a simulation known among the cadets for pushing things just a little too far. A non-Lithari had once passed out in under 90 seconds. The instructor who set the assignments, Commander Quarren Jex, said nothing when Nara questioned the change. He simply smirked with the corners of his scaly mouth and said, "You're free to withdraw under Article 14. That's what your kind usually do." That night, while the other cadets ran calculations and reviewed protocols, Nara sat on the edge of her bunk staring at the ceiling. Her roommate, a soft-shelled Drenari named Kith, tried to be kind. "You can still ask to be moved," he said, glowing faintly in the dim light. "They'll understand." But Nara shook her head slowly. "If I back down now, they'll remember that. If I fall on my face, they'll expect it. I'd rather give them something they'll never forget." Kith had no answer to that. The next morning, Nara entered the simulation bay alone. Pod 19 waited, its outer shell humming with power, lights flashing in warning. Around the room, cadets and instructors watched from the observation deck. Most assumed it was going to be a quick failure. Some even looked uncomfortable. The few who believed she'd hold out longer expected she'd pass out gracefully. No one expected a win. No one expected survival. Inside Pod 19, the simulation's AI greeted her in a calm voice. "Welcome, Cadet Vel. Initiating Class 7 gravitational Scenario. Equipment status incomplete. Nara frowned. Define incomplete. Personal dampener missing, safety override disabled. She looked up toward the observation glass. She knew Quarren Jex was watching. His eyes were fixed on his data display. If he noticed anything wrong, he gave no sign. He'd set this up. He wanted her to fail. Maybe not just fail. Maybe break. The countdown began. She didn't have time to react before the floor shifted, and a crushing weight slammed into her chest. Her knees buckled. Vision blurred. The pressure doubled, then tripled. Her heartbeat struggled. Her lungs screamed for relief. And still, she didn't fall. Her hands reached toward the empty holster where her dampener should have been. She knew what was happening. Sabotage. A test she was never meant to pass. She closed her eyes. Not like this, she muttered. That's when the shot came. A whirring turret dropped from the ceiling. It wasn't part of the usual simulation protocol. Nara barely had time to turn her head before it fired, a sharp hiss followed by an impact like being kicked by a meteor. She slammed into the wall and dropped. The blood started to spread, dark, pooling across the floor. The AI announced a flatline. The room outside the pod went silent. At 0 seconds, she was down. At 23 seconds, she moved. And what happened next would ensure no one ever called her just a human again. Outside Pod 19, the simulation chamber was still. A heavy silence fell over the observation deck where cadets and instructors stood watching the screen that showed Nara's vitals. Her heart rate had dropped sharply, then flatlined. No one said anything for a long moment. One of the medical monitors let out a slow, high-pitched tone, the universal sound that meant someone wasn't coming back. Commander Quarren Jex, who had been watching with arms folded and a smirk playing across his face, didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked satisfied. Simulation malfunction, he said flatly. Notify medical for recovery. One of the medical officers hesitated. Sir, her vitals, they're gone. I just said that, Quarren replied, already turning to begin the formal report. Log time of death and prepare the pod for cleanup. Kith, Nara's roommate, stood in the corner, pale and frozen. He hadn't liked the simulation assignment from the beginning, and now that awful feeling in his chest was blooming into something worse. But he wasn't the only one with a strange look. A Zeltrian instructor leaned closer to a data panel, frowning. There's something odd, he murmured. The blood. It's moving. That got a few heads to turn. What do you mean moving? Asked a Lithari cadet, his body glowing with anxious pulses. Against the gravity, the instructor answered, zooming in on the screen. Look, it's not pooling, right? Inside the pod, the red smear beneath Nara's still body shimmered. At first it seemed like a trick of the emergency lighting, but then someone noticed the pattern forming, tiny lines of blood drawing themselves toward her chest, like ants to a nest. The medical scanner picked up a faint spark of activity. It was flagged as an error, dismissed as a glitch. Machines can't detect what they're not programmed to look for. 20 seconds passed. By that time, Quarren was already halfway through writing the official report. He'd chosen words like unfortunate, unexpected, and non-compliance, with physiological limits. He made no mention of the missing safety gear or the modified turret. Why would he? The cadet had entered voluntarily. It wasn't his fault she couldn't survive a test. It wasn't sabotage. It was nature doing its work. At 21 seconds, Nara's fingers twitched. No one saw it. At 22, her back arched slightly. And then, at exactly 23 seconds, Nara sat up. The scream that followed came from the control deck, not from her, but from one of the younger instructors, who dropped his tablet in shock. The room burst into chaos as figures leaned closer to the glass, trying to understand what they were seeing. Naravel stood up, slowly, like someone lifting herself from the bottom of the ocean. Her face was pale, but her eyes were wide open. Her chest, where the turret shot had hit, was soaked in blood, but the wound was gone. Only torn fabric remained. Blood dripped from her hands down her arms onto the floor. But her movements were steady, her breathing calm. She looked Different. More than just alive. More than just standing. She looked focused. Then people saw what she was holding. In her right hand, connected by torn wires and loose circuitry, was a piece of hardware, glowing faintly and sparking. It wasn't a weapon. It was a control core. The same control core that had been mounted inside the command panel of the pod. The one that should have been locked behind shielding. The one responsible for overriding safety measures. No one had opened the pod systems. No one had approached. And yet somehow Nara held it. Security alarms flickered but didn't trigger. Outside, Quarren's face twisted in disbelief. "That's not possible," he whispered. The room grew colder, not from temperature but from something else. A slow understanding crawling over the skin of everyone present. She wasn't supposed to survive. She wasn't supposed to get up. And she certainly wasn't supposed to take control of the simulation system like it was a toy. Nara stepped toward the transparent door of the pod. It slid open without being told to. The lights inside dimmed and emergency lighting took over. The red hue cast her blood-soaked uniform in terrifying contrast. She walked into the chamber, holding the sparking control unit in one hand. She didn't limp. She didn't shake. Her eyes scanned the stunned crowd like she was choosing her words carefully. Then she smiled. It wasn't friendly. "You left out some interesting safety protocols," she said, her voice calm, almost amused. "Thought I'd bring them to your attention." No one spoke. The silence was a vacuum. Kith stared, his mouth open. He'd never seen her like this. None of them had. "Recovery complete," she added, holding up the broken core. "And system errors corrected." Quarren stepped forward, finally finding his voice. What did you do?" Nara looked at him and tilted her head slightly. Her eyes glinted with something cold. "I adapted. And in that single moment, the Celestia Core Academy, a place built on ranking species by potential, realized it had made a mistake. A very human mistake. It had underestimated the one thing it didn't understand. And now it had 23 seconds to figure out what came next. The command center was quiet, but not the peaceful kind. It was the silence that followed something no one could explain, a silence so deep that even blinking felt too loud. Naravel stood at the center of the simulation chamber, her blood-soaked uniform clinging to her frame, the lights flickering above her like the aftermath of a storm. In her hand, the broken control core still sparked faintly, leaking coolant and fried data chips. Quarren Jek stared at her from across the chamber, his normally confident posture now tight and cautious. For the first time, the smug curve of his lips had vanished. No one moved. No one knew how to. The system had declared her dead. The sensors had registered no pulse, no brain activity. Her heart had stopped. But now she stood, not only alive, but stronger. Something had happened in those 23 seconds, something the Academy's top scientists couldn't predict and their scanners couldn't explain. A medical team finally approached, stepping slowly, as if afraid she might fall apart or explode. One of the medics, a four-armed Valorian, lifted a scanner to her chest where the blood had dried in odd patterns. The reading blinked 3 times, then displayed, wound healed, internal damage repaired, vital signs stable. The medic looked confused. "There's no sign of trauma," he said, "not even bruising." "That's because the damage was already fixed," Nara said simply. Her voice was calm, but her eyes held a spark of something harder to name. "The nanites handled it." The room stirred. Someone whispered, "Nanites?" Someone else echoed, "What nanites?" Nara tilted her head. "You didn't think we came here unprepared, did you?" A Lithari instructor stepped forward, glowing in alarm. "There are no records of human nanotech implants in Academy files." "That's because they're not implants," Nara said. "They're part of us." For a second, everyone just stared. Then murmurs filled the room. Screens lit up as data was pulled from archives and instructors scrambled to find any mention of what she was talking about. But there was nothing. No scans, no warnings, no reports. Just line after line of blank. Quarren's voice finally broke through the noise. That's impossible. You're lying. Nara looked at him, still holding the broken control unit. I... She turned her hand over. A single droplet of blood slid from her fingertip. Instead of falling, it paused mid-air, then stretched like liquid metal and sank back into her skin. The room gasped. The nanites are biologically fused with our blood, she explained. Invisible to your scans, dormant until we need them, designed on Earth, approved under old consortium rules before anyone realized what we were doing with them. Regulation breach, muttered a Drexy officer. Regulation loophole, Nara corrected. According to Section 43Z, any species ranked below Class 3 on the durability scale can apply for genetic enhancements if they're organically compatible. You approved it centuries ago. Just didn't read the fine print. A holographic screen lit up, showing the regulation in glowing yellow. The room fell quiet again. Quarren tried to recover. That still doesn't explain the command core. You shouldn't have been able to access that. Nara turned the device in her hand. The core was tied into the pod systems. When the nanites activated, they followed the source of the threat. They tracked the override signal, bypassed the firewalls, and retrieved the source. You're saying they stole data? I'm saying they defended their host, Nara replied. That's what they're built to do. Heal. Adapt. Protect. Someone in the back of the room said, "But why didn't we know?" "Because you didn't want to know," Nara said, her voice now stronger. "You saw humans as weak, so you never looked deeper. You assumed we had nothing to offer except stubbornness and bad jokes. But we've been evolving too. Just not in the ways you expected." A ripple of realization moved through the crowd. The aliens around her weren't just confused anymore, they were afraid. Not because she had attacked anyone, not because she'd threatened them, but because she had survived something no one should have. Because her blood had remembered, repaired, and responded without anyone knowing it could. "Human blood," whispered a Lithari cadet. "It learns. It remembers," Nara said. "It keeps track of trauma, stores response patterns. That's why I didn't die. That's why the system failed to record the change, because by the time it understood what was happening, I wasn't dying anymore." Quarren stepped back. His eyes darted to the command unit, then to the room full of cadets and instructors, many of whom were now recording, broadcasting, and no doubt spreading the story across the entire system. Whatever his plan had been, it had failed, and more than that. He was now the villain in the first truly terrifying human legend the galaxy had ever seen. Nara turned to leave the chamber, blood drying on her arms in unnatural patterns that shimmered briefly before fading. As she passed the doorway, she looked over her shoulder. "You wanted to see if we'd break," she said. "Next time, be careful what you test for." And with that, she walked out, leaving behind a silence filled with questions no one was ready to answer. News of what happened in Simulation Pod 19 didn't just spread, it exploded. Within hours, whispers turned into reports, and reports turned into full-blown broadcasts that rippled through every level of the Celestia Core Academy, and beyond. Stories flew faster than ships, and soon, every corner of the consortium's connected worlds had heard about the human cadet who died, stood up 23 seconds later, and walked out holding the control core of a rigged simulation in her hand. The details changed depending on who told it. Some said she bled shadows, others claimed she laughed as the turret fired. A few insisted she never actually died, that it was all a trick. But no one could deny the same three facts. Nara Vel had been declared clinically dead, she had survived, and she had exposed a hidden truth that the consortium had never seen coming. The official response came quickly, and it was everything you'd expect from a system run by ancient species with a reputation to protect. A formal investigation was launched. Commander Quarren Jex was removed from his post, stripped of rank, and reassigned to a deep space research outpost so remote it didn't even have a proper name, just a number and a lot of methane. The Academy issued a statement filled with carefully chosen words like oversight, unauthorized simulation parameters, and unanticipated biological factors. It was neat, tidy, and entirely designed to avoid the phrase human nanites. But behind the polished reports and controlled press briefings, change was already starting to take root. The Academy updated its training protocols. Human cadets were moved from Category 2.7 to Category 4.9 on the biological resilience scale, just below shapeshifters and plasma-based life forms. It was a number that didn't mean much to most people, but to those in the Academy it was massive. For the first time, humans were no longer seen as the weakest species in the room. Diplomatic channels lit up with sudden interest in Earth. Species that had once dismissed humans as a minor evolutionary accident now requested meetings with Terran ambassadors. Trade agreements were rewritten, alliances re-examined. Everyone wanted to know, if humans had hidden this for so long, what else were they capable of hiding? Nara herself wanted none of the attention. She declined every interview, every award, and every honorary medal. When offered a high-ranking position within the Academy or even a spot on the Central Command Board, she turned it down. Instead, she chose a posting on a small Vanguard-class exploration ship bound for the edge of known space. It was the first time a human had ever been selected as a tactical officer on such a mission. Her name would be added to history books, but she didn't seem to care. "I just want to keep moving," she told Kith before leaving. It's the only way to stay sharp. Before she departed, a small ceremony was held at the simulation chamber. No grand speeches, no marching bands, just a single plaque, placed quietly on the wall outside Pod 19. It read, "Every second counts when you sow. Think it's your last." Below that, her name. Below that, nothing more. The message was simple like her, uncomplicated but unforgettable. The story of Pod 19 became more than a story. It became a legend, then a warning, then a lesson. Other academies began using it in their training. Lessons on underestimation, adaptation, and the importance of never ignoring the quiet ones. Even now, when new cadets walk past the simulation chambers, some of them glance at Pod 19 with a mixture of fear and respect. They don't talk about what happened, not in detail. But they know. Everyone knows. And the humans, they didn't gloat. They didn't demand apologies. Instead, they kept doing what they always had. Adapting, learning, and surviving. But now, when they walked into rooms filled with beings that used to look down on them, the atmosphere had changed. There was a new weight behind the way others looked at them. It wasn't fear exactly, but it was close. One ambassador from a crystalline race said it best during a closed-door meeting. "We are not afraid of what the humans are. We are afraid of what they might be." Somewhere out beyond the edge of mapped space, Nara stood on the bridge of her new ship, gazing out at stars no one had named yet. The crew around her, composed of 6 different species, watched her with subtle respect. She still looked like the same cadet from Earth, medium height, average build, calm eyes. But the silence that followed her, the kind that made people wonder what she knew that they didn't, that silence was new. The stars ahead were quiet, but Nara smiled. The galaxy had finally started paying attention, and she wasn't done yet.